Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Law.
The 1986 Indiana General Assembly is history. Members of the Indiana Senate and Indiana House have gone home to campaign for re-election and have left us with their legacy. What does that include for 1986? Well, there's a first step toward license branch reform, a first step toward a lottery for the state of Indiana, perhaps pari-mutuel betting, a first step toward some welfare reform, a first step toward answering some of the questions about liability insurance, the insurance crisis as we've talked about. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll give a review of what it is that happened in the Indiana legislature. Our panelists will be Bruce Galehood from the Department of History at Ball State University, Ray Sheely from the university's Department of Political Science, and John Rouse, also from Political Science. I read a newspaper article reviewing this in the late days of the General Assembly, and the headline said something about legislature still has much to do and very little time. Was there really anything the legislature had to do? I mean, are we just dealing with perhaps perceptions of make work for the legislature? John, was there something they really had to do coming into the session?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer. I don't think it did very much. We have a very incremental system, and most of the issues that we had this year were ones that were left over from last year. So in the sense of doing something that was drastic or radical, I would say not.
Okay, what did we accomplish? What are the highlights of the session?
Well, Larry, let me point out that when the legislators say the budget is off limits, and they're not going to touch the budget, then we're really down to, you might say, fads, different types of issues that are going to arise, but we're really not going to spend much money on it. As a matter of fact, the only real money spent in this session had to deal with some of the bills out of the Department of Education, and they weren't major appropriations by any stretch of the imagination. The budget was off limits. They said they weren't going to open it up. There was going to be no real new priorities in terms of spending.
About $19 million, but really in terms of the overall budget, that's pretty insignificant.
Sure. It certainly is. So that's why other issues started dominating the agenda, such as license branch reform. I think if there was a must issue this session, that was the issue. It was on the minds of the politicians. It had been an issue. The Republicans had to import their national pollster to convince the Republican legislators that they had to do something to change the way the license branches are run in Indiana, because the Democrats were going to get votes if reform didn't come. So that had to be a front burner item in the legislature.
Bob Orr signed the bill for this so-called license branch reform. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. It goes into effect over the next couple of years. But when he signed the bill, he said it was a grand and glorious moment, an historic moment. Senate Pro Tem Bob Garton said, in referring to license branch and some other issues, that the legislature acted with great cooperation and political courage. Well, is that what we got from license branch reform? Do we have a grand and glorious piece of legislation?
Well, I think not. I think it was more a product of the Republicans having to go along because they were in a political hammerlock with, and they had to cry uncle to get out of it. Frankly, Teeter, who is the Republican national pollster, he's from Detroit, Bob Teeter came in and said there's at least 100,000 votes that will turn on whether or not license branches are reformed. And 100 to 150,000 votes will often mean victory or defeat at the state level. And if they go Democrat over the license branch issue, obviously the Republicans could blame themselves. So as to whether or not it's real reform, I think the Republicans at least started the process. The reform is the way they want it to happen. They're going to hang on to the branches for a couple of
years. Is this legislation not Republican legislation addressing what essentially was a Democratic campaign issue going back to '84?
I would think that the Republicans, Ray used the term escape the hammerlock here. I would say that perhaps the Republicans at this point have escaped the hammerlock rather gracefully. They've taken an issue which, as near as I could tell, was a very embarrassing situation for them 2 years ago, and they're claiming credit for now the process of reform. through an interesting set of parliamentary maneuvering, the individual Wayne Townsend, State Senator Wayne Townsend, who originally promoted license branch reform, is now almost seen as opposing the bill which emerged from the deliberations of the General Assembly. He seems to be the one that's almost now applying the brakes to license branch reform, in the sense that he didn't think the legislation went far enough. Now he's holding down that flank of more meaningful, thoroughgoing reform, he might want to say. Nevertheless, the governor is taking credit for moving the process through, and as he indicated in his statements, he's talking about a significant piece of legislation which will reverse or significantly change a state practice which has been in effect since the days of the Great Depression.
Bruce, but let me get back to the question that Larry asked. He asked, was anything new, as I understood it? If you don't tinker with the finances, if you don't tinker with the allocation process of money in society, that's the most radical thing you can do, it seems to me. But let me ask both of you, in terms of the incrementalism radical issue, I mean, wasn't license branch reform, in terms of what we got, just something more in terms of incrementalism?
Well, it's a change. I think it's a significant change, John. As to being incremental, of course, we had a reform bill that passed back 15 years or so ago in the General Assembly.
1971, I believe.
That was then overturned by the very next session because they felt they didn't have enough projections as to what the reform would cost, etc. So this issue has been alive and been moving around the Indiana General Assembly for years. But it never really changed since the 1930s, when Governor McNutt had established patronage-run license branches. So I think it is a significant change. Now, I think you could rightfully argue, Bruce, that perhaps the change is taking too long, that the parties are still holding on to too much money, that the corruption is still not going to be weeded out fast enough. You can make all those types of criticisms, but nonetheless, the state will take over the branches July 1 of 1988, and that's a significant change.
Well, let me follow up. You know, I think the Republicans have perhaps taken us down the road to centralization and socialism. I mean,
Now, what do you mean by that,
okay.
John?
All right, I guess I better try to explain myself. If you look at the welfare concerns, the takeover of the county welfare offices, that's going to be a state function. If you look at the license branch reform, that's going to be a state function. If you look at the need in terms of the poor relief kinds of concerns, in terms of the fact that those kinds of issues could not be handled at the local level, if you look at the whole unitary system, which of course most people don't realize that the state is a unitary system where the local politicians in Delaware County have to go to the legislature to ask for a 1% raise of taxes, aren't we drifting towards centralization and socialism in an incremental way, a la republicanism? Bruce?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
These are, as we've said different times, I think these are modest sorts of issues. The kinds of things that you've talked about here, the welfare system, let's just take that for example. And Ray is much more knowledgeable about this than I, but my perception of the issue is this, that states, municipalities and localities have been so hamstrung on their finances for the past, when property tax reform went in the early years of the Bowen administration, they simply are running out of funds. They need to go to the state. They need to ask for more funds. This is going to be that element. Their own finances are so tight that they have to resort to that. And secondly, I get the impression, although this has not come out, that perhaps the leaders of state government, the governor, and perhaps the speaker and the people in the Senate, are getting the sense that with either Graham Rudman or a tightening nature of fiscal conservatism at the federal level, that the time is coming rapidly, if it's not already here, that state government is going to have to take on a larger and larger percentage of these sorts of social welfare kinds of issues. And really what we're talking about is poor relief. As I understand, we're talking about
education could be thrown in there too, of course.
But education is handled, as Ray suggested earlier, in only just a modest way in these off-year sessions. These are education expenses. Education appropriations are part of the biennial requests, which come in well, the next one will come, of course, in '87.
Well, hasn't the legislature created the state as big brother for a lot of these functions, particularly the funding end of it, by putting real strict controls and limits on local government's ability to raise funds? If you want money for extra welfare expenses, you go to the state. You want new money for education, you go to the state. Hasn't the legislature, essentially since 1973, said, we're big brother, you want more money? Yes, you have to come to the state.
I think that's exactly true, but if you go back to 1973, that was a very popular stand for the state to take at the time, was to be able to, essentially the governor at the time, and I presume some of the legislative leaders as well, saying, we're going to try, you Mr. and Mrs. Local Taxpayer, we're going to try to, restrain your property taxes and local levies and that sort of thing. And that was considered as a popular thing. Now, two items relating to finances which were not raised. Both Allen County and, as I understand, Delaware County received authorization from the state legislature to level 1% taxes on hotel and beverage charges and be able, as I understand it, earmark the revenue toward local economic development programs. Now that's something of a I don't know how strong and significant it is, but it's a breakthrough, at least in the sense of allowing localities to raise taxes beyond what they normally have in place for specific purposes.
Well, local option's nothing new, though. Obviously,
but this style of this particular, both in Allen County and Delaware County, this particular tax is modeled on the Marion County arrangement with the Indianapolis Marion County Convention Center, as I understand.
And Vanderbilt.
That sort of thing.
Larry, I think that probably most citizens don't realize that we have a federal system on the national level in which, of course, the states have guaranteed rights. The counties and the cities, of course, don't have any guaranteed rights under a unitary system, never have since the beginning of time. And so this is the kind of thing we really can expect, is it not? Centralization from the state level?
Well, yeah, let me comment on that. I think there's several things that have been happening. Certainly the reforms passed in 1973 under Governor Bowen that we all refer to as the Bowen tax package in Indiana. That did a lot to centralize state. State became the big brother. We doubled our sales tax in order to cut property taxes by 20% and to pick up increased costs of schooling. If you take a look at the figures, for example, just in school expenditures, in 1972, about 2/3 of our bill for public education in Indiana was raised out of property taxes. 15 years later, it's only 1/3. The whole thing shifted. The state now picks up 2/3 instead of the local taxpayers. I don't think property taxes are a popular tax. I think what's happening is the state is responding to the fact that they have the power statewide through income taxes and through the sales tax to generate massive amounts of revenue in a popular way, okay? That is, our sales tax dribbles out a penny at a time instead of having to write a big check on May and November for property taxes. So the state's responding to that.
But we had Wayne Townsend on this program, and of course the governor was talking about these issues, and we'll talk about the quality of life was the phrase that Wayne had. The golden age was the phrase that the governor had. Is there any indication that the citizens are pushing this state towards the golden age or a higher quality of life? Because after all, they don't want to pay any more taxes.
Well,
isn't more taxation going to bring us a supposedly
there's the perennial problem.
Sure,
there's the perennial problem. Everybody wants the services, but nobody wants to pay for them. That's why I think that's one of the pressures, Larry, that makes the state or Big Brother atmosphere prevail. Because we can get to our city council faster than we can get to the General Assembly, and consequently, if there's going to be a tax increase, it's going to more likely happen at the state level.
Ray, let me ask you this question, and I think this is really more a fundamental question about the structure of state government in Indiana rather than any specific discussion of an issue such as license branch reform or repeal of the prohibition on the lottery or so forth. But recently, a somewhat well-known economist in Indiana severely criticized the leaders of the General Assembly for concentrating on just the kinds of issues and legislative proposals that we've just now been discussing. And maintain that what really should be looked at more strongly are the condition of the state roads and infrastructure in general, education, The implication being that, educationally speaking, Indiana is indeed lagging behind the educational systems in in Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, other states, and that the state legislature was essentially bogged down in what he called trivia, or trivial issues. Can those sorts of issues that he raised, education, infrastructure, can they be raised effectively in a state where the legislature just meets such a short time every other year? Are we to the point now where the problems are such that we almost have to think about the whole notion of a citizen legislature as almost kind of an anachronism? Does the legislature have to sit for a longer period of time each year in order to address these sorts of questions? I'm not advocating one position or another,
Right.
but the problems that we're discussing don't seem to be able to be lend themselves to a kind of a resolution if the legislature is only going to meet for a certain specified period of time every other year and be done by the 1st of March or thereabouts.
Well, you probably saw the figures, Bruce. I think we're paying somewhere around $20,000 to $22,000 a year for our legislators. That's a full-time salary. That's about the median American salary per household, and we're getting part-time work out of them. So maybe we ought to require them to meet longer. In fact, it's a minor way to achieve it. It's just a law. In fact, it's just a rule, really, of the legislature. There's no constitutional requirement on how long or how short the session should be. A more fundamental question, though, is I'm not so certain the length of the session connects to what issues are actually addressed by the legislature. Somebody's responsible for setting the agenda in this state. That's usually the governor, the Speaker of the House, and the leadership in the Senate. Those men and those women, if they get together and decide that these kinds of issues will be on the agenda, the legislature will address them. We all know that. Things are kept off the agenda if those men and those women decide that it should be kept off. So criticisms as to the fact that, and sometimes I criticize the process, I say they fund fads. Along comes a fad and let's fund it. Computers are selling now, so we'll have all the school districts buy computers. Next year, maybe it's hula hoops, who knows? But we'll put money into it if it's the popular thing. And indeed, sometimes we don't get to the fundamental gut issues, such as infrastructure, such as the way in which our teachers are going to develop in terms of a career, those kinds of things.
And I think that could be illustrated perhaps with the issue of making the state superintendent for public instruction, should this person be elected or selected? And it's really not all that important. The real issue is, it seems to me, how much money we have behind education. And it's kind of a superficial kind of issue.
Well, the legislature is part of the political system that answers to the short-term political questions, and you say not necessarily the long-term answers to some of the more complex questions. I mean, isn't that just the nature of the legislature?
Sure, I think so. On the other hand, Larry, there are other men and women in state government that set the agenda. And if they set the agenda for a long-range program, the legislature will deal with it. And in that sense, I think we have to look at our executive officials, but primarily the governor.
They don't just wait for the hue and cry of the citizens to stand up and say, you must take action on long-term planning for education.
And it seems to get back to Larry's first question. Larry asked the question, did the legislature have to do anything? And the answer seems to be, except for the various political implications in terms of the shifting of votes here and there, there's no great cry from the public, from the grassroots, we want change. They want less taxes, and so with less taxes, perhaps we'll have less change.
If there was a real citizen input on an issue in this session, might it have been the issue of amending the Constitution to allow gambling, to allow lotteries? Wasn't that one where a lot of people, a lot of legislators finally said, okay, if you want it, we'll give it a try?
I think that's true. I would disagree a little bit with John about we want less taxes. I think the attitude of the voters may be, well, we don't want any more taxes at this level. I don't see any tax cut proposals coming out of the General Assembly. At least if they did, they escape me somewhat. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right, John, about the political nature of the short session. And this is a question I'd like to throw out to Ray, too. Is this short session, for example, perhaps both sides, Republicans as well as Democrats, trying to clear the decks for the next gubernatorial election here in 1988. And by that I mean the license branch reform issue is something that I think the Republicans generally acknowledge, and you cited the pollsters' recommendations to a good degree, as a time bomb just waiting to explode on them. And the time to get it out of the way politically is now. It may cost you, I think to a certain extent, the issue may still cost Republicans votes in 1986. It may not result in as many votes as the Democrats would like, but it may cost them some, but maybe not 100,000.
Right.
But it's a way of removing this, letting people forget about it in 1987. 1988, it's not going to be around necessarily, or if it is around, people can say, well, at least we're moving in the direction, Republicans can say we're moving in the direction of this commission. The commission, I think, is supposed to begin real operations in 88 and 89. I don't think that's a mistake for that particular timing of those 2 years. And so really what we're trying to do is an exercise politically in damage control in this particular year.
See, the original purpose of a short legislative session was to deal with emergencies that happened that would occur in the budget, such as if our projections were wrong on revenue, as you know, Larry. So consequently, they could come in and quickly fix the budget. And in fact, a lot of other states call the short session the emergency budget session. Okay, they just come in to deal with emergency measures that they didn't have information on back the previous year. Well, frankly, we don't handle it that way in Indiana. We allow as many bills to be introduced or subject matters of bills. There's no restrictions on those. There's a different limit on the number of bills each legislator can introduce, but that's a minor difference. So consequently, it ends up to be a general session, but in a collapsed time, in a compressed time period. And they are able to clear the deck, so to speak, as you say, Bruce, only because they don't bring the budget issues in. They usually say, well, we're not opening the budget for any even emergency type bills, unless if all the leadership agrees, such as this session to the tune of about 19 million.
Yeah, the short session is always the election year session, and that's it involves a lot of posturing, obviously, politics. Republicans felt a great deal of pressure to do something about license branch reform this year before the election, because polls showed that politically they had to.
Well, and I think, Larry, your point on the so-called lottery pressure also, because it was an election year, it went this year instead of last year, which was a non-election year, and they felt the pressure from the people breathing down their neck, so to speak.
But it's interesting, as Larry was pointing out here, now you have a group that's been formed, which is going to campaign against those senators who voted for the lifting of the prohibition. So that element, whereas the political representatives in Indianapolis may have said, all right, voters, or you want this, now you're going to have a backlash. And this could be a major issue in the fall with people who have taken a stand now for lifting the prohibition on this, being the targets now of
special interest politics.
But aren't the same people who oppose the lottery, aren't they the very same people who are opposing any increase in taxes? With Graham-Rudman coming in, there's going to be the need to shift taxes and not raise taxes, and so therefore the lottery is a convenient way out to raise some monies.
I think the lottery issue is so complex, John. You can justify or not justify the lottery on so many economic or moral grounds that who knows what. I don't see the lottery as necessarily a response to shortfalls that the state may have in regard to Graham-Rudman. I think the lottery politically is more, at least as I understand the political leadership in Indianapolis talking, people saying we're losing so much so-called gambling money to other states.
We're losing time right here now. Let's catch you off, Bruce. Thanks for your comments. Thanks to our panelists, Ray Sheely, Bruce Galehood, and John Rouse for the comments here today. I'm Larry Law. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services. the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.